Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Experts Live India podcast. I'm Samir, and today I'm joined by Kenny. Hey, Kenny.
Good morning. Thanks for
Good
having me.
morning. Thanks for joining us. Kenny is my manager. Kenny. So I have the privilege of working under Kenny as part of the Geos team here at Dell. Um, Kenny also, so I am mostly focused on Microsoft Azure Stack products, but Kenny also looks after a wider portfolio, not only Microsoft, also goes beyond Microsoft. I think VMware, Nutanix, and I don't even know. Maybe you can tell us what your responsibilities include. So the reason I've asked Kenny to join us today is we're going to talk about. So Kenny is how long have you been an MVP, Kenny?
5 years now, and then let's see in 2 days' time whether that's 6 years.
Oh yeah, your results are due, right?
Yep.
It's 1st July.
Yeah. 1st of July.
Nice. And right after your results come out, I'm gonna apply for my MVP.
Good.
So, double fingers crossed. Cool. So yeah, so he's been doing presentations for a while now. Not only public, but he also conducts trainings internally. So he has the experience of how to, simplify a technical topic, not only to technical people, but also to C-suite, let's say, who are not technical, non-technical managers, or even semi-technical, who understand the concepts on the high level, but they don't want to really go into the bits of each thing, how it works. So yeah, so he has a lot of that experience. So, and he is certainly high up in my list of best presenters I've seen. So it's definitely the right candidate. And of course, the topic for today is how to excel at technical presentations. How do you grab the audience attention? How do you tell a story as opposed to just read out of the slide deck and so on, right? So without further ado, Kenny, let's get straight into it then. Cool. Kenny, let's start by knowing yourself a little bit more.
Sure. So, Kenny Lowe, I lead the Global Engineering Outreach Specialist team in Dell, as you've said. We're the highest tier of technical excellence in the field for our multi-cloud portfolio. So the products that I'm responsible for include the Microsoft Hybrid Cloud portfolio, that's Azure Stack Hub and Azure Stack HCI, and PowerFlex, and then some of our new multi-cloud capabilities coming to market as well, which is pretty exciting. And the other thing I would say is that you said that I'm your manager, but I would say I don't manage anyone. I'm here to give great people the space to be their best selves. So that's more my role. Shielding from stuff from on high, giving the space to be your best, and then signing off expenses and holidays. That's about me.
Amazing. So you, like I said, you've been doing presentations for a while now. So when did you start, and how was your first presentation like?
Yeah, good question. So my first presentation was probably about 8 years ago now, maybe 9 years ago. And it was an internal one in a service provider that I was working at the time. And I decided I wanted to do a presentation. We had this sort of once a month, someone can present to the company about something they're interested in. And I decided I was going to do my first presentation. So it was about lessons from Star Trek applied to the workplace.
Oh wow!
And it was absolutely terrible. It was
No, still, that sounds amazing. I would like to, I'd like to get hands on that recording if you have.
Oh, the content is solid, but the presentation was terrible, and it was mostly because I focused on the technology and the process and not the audience.
Right.
So I was more concerned about using my iPad to control the slides on another device and doing some interesting technical things there. And I had a whole script laid out that I basically read from as well. It it was stilted and jarring and not great, but it was my first one, and it got me past that hurdle. The first step is always the hardest, and
Is the hardest, yeah.
from there you just learn.
Yeah, absolutely. That's pretty much the same for me. When I did, so I won't even go as far as a presentation, but when I first joined 6.5 years ago, when I started my career, just the taking my first client call, it was terrifying. um, I mean, just the pressure of, even if the other person on the other end is the most friendly person in the world, you just sometimes can't muster that courage to, so you keep judging yourself. It's like, am I really making any sense? Or that imposter syndrome. What am I gonna tell this guy that this guy doesn't already know? Right. So that initial hurdle, that initial mentality, I think you have to cross once.
Oh yeah, definitely. Definitely. And there's that big unknown factor as well. When someone phones up and they're going to ask something, you feel like you need to be able to give an answer then and there. You need to be able to bring value to them then. It's not always the case. It's perfectly valid to say, I don't know, but I'll find out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that yes, that happens quite often. Not only on calls but also on meetings, emails, even, right. So I like to take my time, because even if I think I know the answer, I just want to be sure that this answer is correct. So sometimes even if I know the answer, I just hold it up and say, like, you know what, I know the answer, but I'll just go and check that once. So that's absolutely acceptable. That doesn't make you any less of a professional, that than you already are.
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah. So you said something interesting about your first slide deck presentation was you had a script and you read it out word by word.
Mm-hmm.
That has happened to me. I've been doing that since quite recent times. But then I quickly realized that however casual you make it sound, the other person can figure out that this person is probably reading out of the script.
Yeah.
And when you read out of a script that kind of feels like this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, just reading out of documentation or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's the difference between a professional actor and a layperson who's not an actor. The job of an actor is to take a pre-written script and make it sound like it's off the cuff, extemporaneous, that it's not pre-written. That is their job. That's why they're professionals. The vast majority of people are not professional actors. So when you read out a script, it's going to come across as stilted and jarring and not off the cuff. So I don't think that I've planned or thought through, well, no, let's not say thought through, but planned out what I'm going to say in any presentation for probably a few years now. I always have a rough flow of what I want to put into a presentation. There will be a start, a middle, and an end. But what I'm going to say is always 100% off the cuff.
Right. But I wonder if that's that's a skill that you acquire as you get more confident, because even though today I try not to read out of a script, but I still write a script. But now that just be my personal preference. But I do have a script in the slide notes. I don't read it out loud, exactly as it is, but I use it more of a bullet points as talking points in case I am stuck anywhere.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah. So make a script. In my opinion, my humble opinion is do make a script, write it down if you want, but just don't read word to word out of it.
Or even if not a script, bullet points are a really good
Points.
option. They will keep pulling you back to what you want to cover as well, without you having to stop and read and then read out what is on the screen. It's just bullet points to pull you back when you get a little bit off topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So you say that today you don't think a lot about what to say, what to talk about when you make a presentation. So how did you get over this fear of this? Like I said, this is not something that would come overnight to you. This will be a continuous process of getting more and more confident as you present more and more. So the first time, how did you get over the stage, and what has been your progress like?
So I guess I've never been afraid of being on stage. I think the fear for me is presenting to small crowds or small groups of people. If you're presenting to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, that is a lot more scary to me, or has been more scary to me than presenting to a
True.
large audience. Because when I'm presenting to a large audience, I'm basically just projecting out, and it's not necessarily looking for direct feedback or eye contact with each and every one of them.
Right.
If there's one person in a large audience that looks disinterested, you can kind of ignore that. If there are 3 out of 5, then that's a bit more difficult. So small audiences have always been more difficult for me. But it's a different type of presentation, I think. So it comes down to how you gear the presentation style to the audience. If I'm doing it to a large audience, it's going to be talking to the entire group at once and projecting out everything I want to say and not really having a conversation. If it's to a small group, it's going to be conversational. It's going to be a two-way discussion there, not just reading off slideware, because that is not what anyone wants in that situation.
Right. I agree. Like you said, the larger audience is more like you can think of it as a group, as a mass. You just broadcasting to them and not necessarily expecting anyone to return with any questions.
Yeah, and when presenting to a large group, I don't think it's any different than presenting online over a webcam, anything like that.
Right.
It can be just the same. The main difference is that you have a stage to walk around on, you can have stage presence. But the way you speak, the things you do, I think that it's the same style, or can be the same style on webcam and on large stage as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in person, like you said, you have to have, or you have a stage presence because people are able to see you walking, talking, your your whole physical appearance, and so on. How do you think you should grab attention, and what should be your body language when you're making an in-person conversation?
It depends. So some places require you to stand behind a lectern and have a microphone in front of you, in which case you're static there. And you don't have much choice in movement or stage presence, things like that. If you are able to move around, then it comes back to the whole acting thing. How do actors use the stage? So going to a corner for one thing, going to the back for another, using the stage as a timeline as well, using left to right from the audience perspective as past to future is a really powerful thing to do as well. So you can say, well, in the past we did this, and you start going across the stage and it actually walks them through the timeline there. And actually, interesting things you can do there is like jump back to the past, and that's intuitive for them then. Understanding that. But the worst thing I think is just standing in the middle of the stage, arms by your side, talking out statically, not moving. Some expression, some hand movement, some motion keeps the audience engaged there.
And do you really think the dress code matters?
No. I mean, unless there is a specific dress code for an event, and you turn up not in that dress code, then that's probably a bit rude. But otherwise, smart casual is probably what I would typically aim for. I don't turn up to events in suits anymore. I haven't done for a long time. I don't think people come to listen to me to see what I look like. They come to hear what I want to say. And personality and authenticity is more important there than trying to look a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the factors of the contributing fears of speaking to a public is like, how am I going to be judged based on my appearance, physical appearance? Content presentation is one thing, and then am I slouching on stage? Am I walking too much? Am I not walking enough? Is my face not showing my expressions or whatever, or am I getting judged based on my clothes? So personally, from the time I've started presenting, pretty soon COVID hit, so in-person conferences were not a thing. So mostly my presentation experience has been online. I've done maybe like three, 4 in-person talks as of today, but for one, I was attending the conference as an attendee, and one of the speakers didn't show up. So they asked me to take his place, and I went and delivered a session I coincidentally had on my laptop. Of course, I was very casually dressed. I had like a t-shirt and a jeans on. Another time when I was in university, my university for a conference, I was in like a proper, let's say, semi-casual, semi-business attire. I had like a jacket on. I think those should the clothes don't matter, but they wearing certain clothes give you certain confidence is what I feel like.
That's definitely also true. But again, it depends on the situation. If you're the only person wearing a suit and everyone else is casual, then it can feel a bit uncomfortable,
That's
actually.
true.
But, no, clothes can definitely make you feel more comfortable. But there's also the what's the old discussion, the wannabe rich versus the actual rich. The wannabe rich people will go and wear the Gucci and Versace and show off their wealth and what they're wearing, whereas the properly rich people are wearing the jeans and the t-shirt, and actually it doesn't matter to them. When you have the level of expertise that you are comfortable with and able to go on stage and share, it's that matters, not the attire.
Right. Absolutely. I agree with that. So when you make a slide deck, how do you choose what content to include? How do you research? Or when you're, let's say, you're making a business presentation versus a technical presentation, then what kind of content do you look out for?
So the difference between business and technical presentations, actually, in the ones that I'm doing just now, very, very little in terms of the slideware. They're pretty much the same. I might hide a slide that shows specific technical specifications or hardware models, things like that. But for the most part, the slideware will be identical. It's just what I say that will be different,
Right.
and how I say it as well. And that's why, for me, not having a script is actually really useful, because if you have a script, it's going to be tied to the slides and tied to specific clicks and tied to how you move through that slide deck. If you have specific bullet points in your head that you want to touch on for a business audience or a technical audience, actually, you can go through the slide deck as you want, move back and forth, skip on, skip back, whatever, and just talk to it without having to have a specific script or way to go through it. So I don't pretend that that's an easy skill to get to. It takes an awful lot of practice, and it takes an awful lot of practice not just in presenting in general, but in presenting in a specific topic as well.
Right.
I can do this well for Azure Stack. I've presented Azure Stack sessions, I don't know, thousands of times now. So I can just open my mouth and the words come out, and it is pretty straightforward. But it's the same as any skill. It is time and practice and building muscle memory. In this case, muscle memory in the vocal cords, to just spew out what you want to need to there. But for me, the slideware is secondary. It's just a sort of visual or prompt in the background. It's not something I want people to be spending much time paying that much attention to. I want them to be paying attention to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that also, I personally struggle from this. So what happens sometimes is, like you said, sometimes if you are very familiar, if you are if you are an expert in the topic that you're presenting, sometimes I just go on a tangent forever. Right. So having a script, also coming back to making bullet points help you with that, is it keeps you back to the purpose of this specific presentation, right? Because sometimes when I present something, I have a slide, then I remember, okay, you know what, I have a funny story about this, or I have a customer story about this, and then I just talk about that story for a long time, and then more tangents come, and we are all over the shop. We are not, the purpose is not the slide deck at hand anymore. So how do you find that balance as to do less information as opposed to too much information? How do you stay concise?
Yeah. So the first thing that I always tend to do is actually get a feel for what the audience wants, whether that is a small audience or a large one. So if I'm on stage doing a presentation, I'll start off by doing a quick run through of what I'm going to present, the outcomes, and what people can expect through that, and then actually ask the audience, does that sound good? Even if it doesn't sound good to them, at least they know what they're going to get over the next 45 minutes or an hour, or whatever, and it's not going to be a shock or a surprise to them. They're not going to get annoyed that I delivered something that they weren't expecting. If it's a smaller group, then it could be sysadmins, it could be architects, it could be pre-sales or sales or C-suite or whoever. But getting a feel for what their challenges are, what's top of mind for them helps to inform that conversation as well. And that helps you to sort of mentally pull things back to those things that they've told you right at the start as well. So I'll ask these questions. I'll make bullet points on my screen. I've got a screen to my side here, which will just have a list of bullet points of things that I've asked at the start there. And I can always glance off to that side there and pull back to those things as well.
Yeah, because a lot of times it's a version of what you said is like if you can't so this setting this expectations beforehand, I think it happens when you're more in a broadcasting mode, like so if you're presenting and other people are there to listen. But then there are some instances where say you're in a client call or a POC or whatever, and then a lot of times I start by asking them questions. I don't set the expectation myself, but I ask them to set the expectations out of this call. And so it works both ways. So I ask them, okay, hey guys, so I have this deck, but do you want to focus more on this area? Do you want to talk more about this area? So I think it works the both ways depending on what the situation is.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. So speaking of slides, you have, let's say, a 10-slide presentation. First, you start with, introducing yourself, setting up the stage. Then you are in the middle section where you are in the middle of conversation or you're trying to convey the main agenda of the presentation. And then you're towards the end where you're closing off, you're finishing, you're giving the conclusions of the presentation. So how do you maintain that flow? How do you manage that flow?
Well, the first thing is that the introduction to me is largely irrelevant. People don't care that much about the presenter, they care about the content. So the first thing I always do is I say, I'm Kenny, here's my email address, move on quickly. And don't linger on yourself. The worst thing that really, I won't say bugs me, but turns me off any presentation is when you have a 5-minute intro to someone and they're telling you all about their hobbies and their passions and here are the things I've done and here's where I've worked. That's not relevant to the talk. That's not relevant to the presentation you're here for. You're here giving the presentation. I'll assume some level of expertise or knowledge in the subject just because you are doing it. Yeah. I don't need you to tell me why you are right to be doing it right from the start. It also takes away time from the session as well. And if there's a lot of good content, then that takes away from that as well. So intro should be very brief. If people want to know more about you after the fact because they loved your presentation, they can ask. But don't go up front with lots of information about yourself.
Right.
How do I manage the actual start, then the middle and the end? Well, treat it like a story. I mean, that is the essence of a story. So we're not trying to reel out a list of facts. We want to give a compelling journey from where are we at one point, how do we start to solve that, where do we get to? Typical storytelling mechanisms there. Why, and then tie it back to the start. Why does what we've done now at the end solve the thing that was there at the start as well? A lot of times when you go to presentations, when someone finishes, you'll have completely forgotten what they were talking about at the start. People can only remember a small subset of information, maybe 3 to 5 facts that you deliver through that session. If you have a lot of slideware and just progress through reeling off facts, then probably only the last couple are going to be remembered. If you tell a story that has, I don't know, an interesting moral fact or an interesting thing for them to remember, something to stick in the mind, and then you can tie it back to that 1 or 2 times through the session, then that's far more likely to stick in the mind as well. I think there are always, I try to make sure that there are 1 or 2 little phrases that I inject in as well, that I want people to remember as well. So things that are just little memorable little phrases.
Can you give us an example?
No, I can't think of any off my head. But that'll be 1 or 2 of the bullet points that I have. Like I'll think for this customer or this audience, here's the message I want to convey. Here's the thing I want them to remember. I will write that maybe 4 or 5 words up off to the side, and if I can say that 2 or 3 times through the session, then that will help them to remember what I was trying to convey as well.
Right. So I'm curious to know, what do you personally think about the conclusion slide towards the end? Because I don't like to put a conclusion slide exclusively, because then it feels a lot more like a lesson. It feels a lot more like a chapter that you have just learned. So I don't. So like you said, I like to give them a story that you've remembered.
Yeah.
Do you share the same sentiment, or do you think that it's fine to put a conclusion
No,
slide and
I
then
agree. I agree with you. No conclusion slide. Conclusion slide is you telling people what you have told them. So
right?
it's recapping because they have forgotten what you've told them, which means you've already failed, I guess. And they should be
Right.
remembering it all anyway. But also, as soon as you put up a conclusion slide, people turn off. They're like, okay, that's the end. I can switch off. Off I go. Whereas you should be finishing off through the presentation, through speech, through talking to them, not through a prompt on a slide saying this is the end.
Right. Cool. So what kind of research do you do before you go into a session? Or when you select content, do you have to make your own content? Or can you like copy paste from internet and maybe explain on that?
I mostly use other people's content. So whether that's created by people in the community or by our technical marketing teams here in Dell, I will tend to leverage other people's content and not reinvent the wheel there. I will tweak slides. I will change slides. I will never take a slide deck someone else has made and then just use that as is. I will always change the order of slides, maybe hide some, maybe change some text and verbiage, and maybe inject 1 or 2 other things there, combine slide decks. As soon as you're presenting someone else's slide deck, you are effectively reading from a script there, because
That's
that
right.
is a flow that someone else has come up with. So it's just another form of script. You want to make sure that the flow matches your patterns of speech, your patterns of thought as well, where you would get to. You'll often see when people are doing presentations that they will go from one slide to another and stop and go, what was this slide again? Why did they have this in here? And try to remember, and then go, actually, this one doesn't matter. I'll just skip on to the next one. And that's because they haven't thought through the flow of their thoughts and how they would think through it. One of the things I do to prepare is I will put the slide deck up into presentation mode, and I will click through, thinking through the process, not speaking, not trying to do a presentation, but just thinking through all the things that I will say as I go through them. And that process alone will often make me change the order of a slide, or change when something appears on a slide, or change the slide from being text heavy to having a bit less in it, things like that. So I think that a lot of emphasis is put on practicing what you're going to say, but not a lot is put on practicing what you're going to think. And actually, I think that's
Right.
just as important.
Cool. So having a text-heavy slide versus having minimal text on screen, uh, I sometimes I can't decide on which one to choose. I say that because in a live presentation, okay, you can have a minimal, have a slide with minimal text on it. But if it is being recorded, well and good. But if you are presenting somewhere that is not being recorded, and you were asked to share your slide deck, you have very minimal text on the slides. That makes sense to you, sure, because you are an expert in that area. But if someone who's not, of course, having more text, more context to what each bullet point on the slide means, that would be probably a little more helpful to them. So how do you keep that balance? How do you decide which ones to be text
Yeah,
heavy?
there is no one answer to that, because it is sometimes okay and right to have lots of text on the screen. For the most part, it's not, because if people are reading a slide, they're not listening to you. But there are occasions where it's important to show a large number of capabilities in a product set, for example, to show that. I will always preface a text-heavy slide by saying, I'm not going to drain this in detail. I'm not going to read this off the slide. I don't expect you to remember all this. You'll get the slide deck or things like that. But it is very rare when I think that I would do that. For the most part, it's not text heavy. There are occasions where it can make sense, but they're in the minority. You want to make sure people's attention is on you, not on the screen behind you.
Right. Cool. Also, another a slight variation of that question. So you have, let's say, you have a slide and you have some script under in the notes. So when somebody asks you to you share that deck, do you erase the notes? Because then kind of you'd be exposed as to this guy wasn't actually speaking out of his mind. He was just reading out his notes. What do you do then?
I wouldn't mind sharing the notes, but I do tend to erase them, and I think it's because the notes are more of a view into my thought process, not into necessarily what I was wanting people to take away.
Right.
When I share a slide deck after, I want them to go through that and remember what they got from the slides, not what little thoughts I had written off to the side. Often, though, I won't use the notes field in PowerPoint itself. I have another screen where I have OneNote or Notepad with notes, and I use those, so I don't often have to strip them out.
Right. Yeah, I was gonna say you can have two versions of the same deck, and you can have one maybe a little light on text, the other one maybe a little more text heavy. So while you're presenting, you use the one that's light, and when you're sharing, you share the one that has a little more notes, a little more context to it.
Yeah. Or often I'll have slides in there which have more verbiage, which have more information in them, but I'll have them hidden during the presentation. But when it's shared, they have those
Yeah.
to give extra context there.
Absolutely. Cool. So circling back a little to what content goes on to the slides, do you have to make your own content, or can you like copy paste out of the internet? This kind of ties also into content writing, because so I have blogged a lot about Azure Monitor or SCOM and HCI in recent times, but not every time that I have something new to share, right? So I read a lot of documentation myself, and I write whatever I interpret out of those documentation, right? So I don't copy paste the whole thing. I don't copy the Microsoft documentation straight out of their site and post on my blog. No, I don't do that. But of course, my thought process is also inspired by what I've read in maybe different blogs or the documentation. So my tip, because I've been asked this question before, is I want to start blogging. I want to start writing technical, but I don't have anything new to write about.
It's not about having something new. It's about sharing your perspective. Well, actually, it's about two things. It's sharing your perspective and also creating a place for you to document your journey as well. That's what blogging is for. I don't think blogging is there to share wonderful, big, new ideas out to the world all the time. It is primarily for the person writing the blog. If others get value from it, great. But even if something has been written about 100 times, there's still value in writing your own perspective. I mean, the same stories get written over and over and over again. The Lion King is Hamlet. Star Wars is the typical prince rescues a princess, fights the bad guy type story. But you can retell things in different ways. You can bring your own spin to things. So there's absolutely value in writing a blog, even if it's about something that's been done before.
Again, so a lot of people think that it has to be something revolutionary, that's something that people have never read before, but that's a lot of pressure, and I don't think you are supposed to invent every time you write something. You can just write your own perspective of things, like you said, and I like the way you put it, like you because a lot of my blog series, I would say, started off as my own learning of a particular technology. I would make some notes. I would make some copy paste some useful links that I found on the internet. I would make my own notes out of it. And at one point, I would think, hey, you know what? These are actually pretty decent notes. Maybe if I could just add a little more words here and there and give a little more structure to it, I can actually publish it as a blog. So that's absolutely valid as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Cool. So, is content in the slide good enough, or do you also think the presentation or so we've talked about the physical appearance of yourself, speaking on stage, say for example. But on the slide deck, do you have to make animations? Do you have to do fancy things? Do you have to use a theme, which is colorful? Text is flying out here, and then it's floating up from there. Images, use of images. How do you think? What do you think about that?
Images are good. Images stick in people's minds, so definitely good to use images. I think that having a lot of animations is typically a bad thing. I think that if you spend more time creating animations on your slide deck than actually thinking through the content and what you're going to present, then it's not necessarily going to go well. That goes back to the very first presentation that I did remember, where I spent more time on the technology and the process and how I would use my iPad to control the other screen and do specific animations and things there. I
Yeah.
spent all that time on that, not on the actual presentation itself. And how many times have you been watching a presentation where someone goes to the next slide and they start building out an animation and they just go, actually, let me just build out this whole slide and I'll touch the
Yeah.
whole slide. That happens all the time. So how much time has been wasted making the animations just to skip through them and waste people's time and make people think, actually, they've not planned through what this presentation is going to look like. There is one exception there, which is the awesome feature in PowerPoint called Morph, where basically you have one slide, then you have another slide, and you just go to the transitions tab and you click Morph, and that's the transition between them. And that creates some really nice slick transition from one slide to another. I use that all the time, in particular for building out content on a slide. Sometimes it is valid to build stuff out. Instead of fiddling around with animations and things like that, I will create the slide with all the content on it. Then I will duplicate that 2 or 3 times. Then I'll just do a white block over the bits that I want to hide, and then change the size of that through the other slides and just morph between them. It takes seconds to do. It
Nice.
makes your deck much, much bigger in the back end, but when you're presenting, it just morphs beautifully between them. It takes no time to do. It looks nice and slick.
Yeah.
So Morph is an unsung hero, I think, of PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's a good tip. One other thing I can also say about having too many animations is, like you said, first you can, there are many instances where you wait for all the animations to finish. And because I've had to do this myself a lot of times, because if you want to go back to another slide, you know what, let me jump back a little, go a couple slides back and have that, let's say it has a, so to give you an exact example, so in our Azure Stack HCI presentation, there is one Azure Stack architecture diagram. And then as you go further in the presentation, sometimes I have to go back to that architecture diagram. And if I have a lot of animation in each of my slide, I have to press the back button a lot of times.
Yeah,
Because that is awkward, first of all. So just a waste of everybody's time.
absolutely. Yes.
Cool. Any other tips and tricks Kenny would like to share with us?
So Morph is number 1. My number 2 tip and trick is using Windows multiple desktops a lot. One thing that can be annoying or break you from the flow of a presentation is when someone has to exit PowerPoint to bring up a web browser to show you something, and then go back to PowerPoint, and then they share it to the wrong screen, and it can be a whole mess. If you start off your presentation with Windows multiple desktops, or Linux or Mac, we all support them, but multiple desktops regardless, and on one you have PowerPoint, and on another you have a web browser open and ready, then you can just switch from the PowerPoint to that other desktop with, what's it, Windows key, Control Windows key in left and right. And that allows you to switch directly between being in PowerPoint Presenter View and a web browser and back without ever breaking out. So it also allows you to do it without breaking the flow of your speech as well. Because when you have to break out of PowerPoint, you say, wait a minute, I'm just going to stop PowerPoint. I'm going to bring up a web browser. You talk through what you're doing. If you go to another desktop, you can just keep on speaking as you do it. And so you go very seamlessly from the presentation to the demo and back without ever breaking the flow. And I find that that is a pretty powerful way to do
Yeah,
things.
I must admit I am guilty of that crime. Because if I want to switch from a PowerPoint to, let's say, a demo, yes, I still do that sometimes. But yeah, I should follow your tip.
Well, and in general, just narrating what you're doing is something that people do a lot as well. So, how many times do you hear, "Can you see my screen yet?" when
Oh
doing
yeah,
an online
yeah,
presentation? I just trust the technology. When I'm going to present, I share it, and if it's not working, someone's going to tell me.
tell you.
But
Yeah,
there is this thing called bystander syndrome, where if you ask a crowd something or a crowd to do something, everyone assumes someone else will do it, and then no one does it. So when you say to a crowd, "Can you see my screen?" there's this awkward silence. Well, everyone waits for everyone else to reply. Eventually, someone else does, but actually, I think that starts the presentation off on the wrong foot because it's made everyone feel a little bit uncomfortable there.
yeah,
So just not saying, "Can you see my screen?" actually helps get off on the right foot there as well.
yeah. I agree. But sometimes I am paranoid. I am skeptical as to because if you are actually in the middle of the presentation and after 5 minutes if somebody says I can't actually see your screen, so how I personally deal with that is if my presentation is say at 1, I join at like what 12:55, at least 5-10 minutes early, and there's always one or two guys who join early, so they can be your verification factor, and you can ask them, hey, can you guys see my screen? Okay, then I keep it on, keep my presentation, my first slide on for a while, and then at 1 or 1:05 I start my presentation. But that's, I guess, just a personal choice.
Well, that's preparation, and preparation is key to any presentation. And preparation doesn't mean having to sit down and practice the talk over and over and over again. It's knowing your technology, it's knowing your flow, knowing your thought process, kind of having a feel for what you're going to do, and just looking professional as well. As soon as you're having to apologize for doing something,
Yeah.
it breaks out of that feeling of professionalism.
Yeah. Cool. Um, we actually flew through the time. It's already 42 minutes. Again, I would say one tip I saw, maybe I think it was in your presentation only, um, that failing to prepare is preparing to fail. And that kind of stuck with me because that is actually so true.
Well, so that was from a presentation that myself and Jeremy did about how to deliver an effective technical presentation. And that was one of the things I wanted to get across. So I had that written up as a bullet point off to the side. Let's make
Yeah,
sure that we get that phrase in there, and it sticks good.
it
Um,
does.
yeah.
Yeah, it is. First of all, it is very catchy and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I guess the last thing that I want to say is that I don't consider myself an expert here. I do get a lot of people telling me that I present well and that I am good at it. That doesn't mean I know how. That doesn't mean I necessarily know what it is that I do, which goes into delivering that. I enjoy it. I just open my mouth and speak, and I try to engage and connect with the audience. I know my tech, I know my content, I know how to use PowerPoint, how to switch desktops, things like that, so I don't have to think about them. But it's a constant learning journey for me as well. Um,
Yeah, I was
so,
going to say, after doing 1,000 presentations, do you still think today that you have something to improve?
oh, I still do some terrible presentations. There are still some times where I will finish off and think, "Oh my word, that was just awful."
Yeah,
They're fewer and further between now, but typically that happens when I haven't been able to engage with the audience, when I've misjudged what their wants or expectations are, or maybe they're just a hostile audience. If you have
yeah,
a hostile audience, then there's very little that you can do, because you need to have that connection. I think to have an effective presentation, it's not a one-way communication path.
absolutely. Cool. Thank you so much, Kenny, for joining me today. This was very helpful. Um, I hope people who have attended or listened to this podcast will also take some new, tips and tricks, like you said. The first one, just to give a conclusion slide, to not be afraid to start. because everything starts small. Even this podcast is, I am like what 6, 8 episodes in now, but it's not like I have thousands of people listening to this. It may be 5, maybe 10, maybe 100. Never know. You just have to start from somewhere. Don't be afraid. Do the proper preparation. Um, Make sure that you're consistent with your messaging, right? Be confident about what you're saying. Be concise. Don't tangent off a lot, and use multiple desktops.
Oh yeah.
And if you are doing it on PowerPoint, then also the morph. There are not only morph, but there are a lot more features in PowerPoint that I think are not celebrated enough. Should probably be more used than they are today.
Sounds like a good blog.
Oh yeah, maybe I'll write a blog and publish it. Awesome. Thank you so much, Kenny. Again, thanks a lot for your time, and I'll see you in the next one.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Cheers.